Thanks for coming back and joining us. We hope I know I've had some productive learning time within my own thoughts in space, and I hope you've had some takeaways as well. I will say today is going to be a lot of great content. We had some feedback about communications last time and getting more, deep and broader into communications, and Clea's got some great work for us in that space. And then we're going to bring the leadership lens behind that and how this leadership stuff kind of glues us all together. So, with that, let's give a little bit of voice to what you've been doing since we were last together. We're just going to take two voices in this space. If someone would love to come off mute, we'd love to hear your voice. What have you been doing since the last time we were together? An idea of leading through project change. We have enough information here to warrant an entire year-long intensive, and that would be maybe cool, Wallace Center. We could think about that, and Food System Leadership Network folks. That would be absolutely exciting. But as we always say, from our heart to yours, systems change is heavy and it's big, and we are changing just that, systems much larger than all of us. So any work at any scale, whatsoever in your capacity, you are valued, your work is critical, and it's absolutely necessary for the days coming forward. Absolutely. Yeah. So here's grounding ourselves in this experience. What we're really working on is the culmination of making sure our structures and projects have impact, frameworks, and processes are designed to be more intentional. That's what we've been doing thus far. Here's where we're going today. And with that, I'm really excited. Let's get into some breakout rooms and talking. Faction mapping, this idea of whom we must engage, what is going on behind them, what do they value, what are they loyal to? If we make some progress in this area, what might they risk losing? Okay. We've got
the waterfall of people joining back into the session. So I hope that you all had some really stimulating, engaging conversations. I'd be surprised if you all made it through every single question on there, but is an opportunity to keep that conversation going outside of this space, apply it to your other spaces. And we are going to jump right back in. And this slide may look very familiar to you all. This is the premise of this course that we discuss throughout each one of our sessions, that we are trying to create a project leadership ecosystem. And we will keep referencing this as we continue through the session today. Next slide. So at this point, we're going to get into content. And third session, we have shared tools and resources, processes, and frameworks to better help you diagnose the projects you're tackling. And with the concepts we present today, we hope that you'll be in a better position to design projects for lasting change. So we're going to pick up from our session last week, where several of you expressed interest in strategic communications. We didn't have time to get into it then, but we made some space for it in this session in a way that makes sense. So let's go to the next slide. Just some basics about strategic communications. It's about essentially having the right person say the right thing at the right time, which means it takes some analysis. So I'm going to walk you through a few general process steps to aid in the execution of this as a part of your communications plan. So first, we need to be clear on the issue at hand by distinguishing between an issue and a problem. So a problem may not necessarily require a solution, but rather understanding or clarification. It can be broader and more general. And by contrast, an issue is a difficulty or obstacle that requires a specific solution. Thus, it can be more focused and concrete and contained within a problem. So then what we move into is kicking off the process of issue selection. So whomever you're working with, a good question to ask is, what are the criteria for a good issue for our organization? So going through this process, you'd want to engage folks, capture what they say, and then try to develop an evaluation checklist. And I'll show you an example from the Midwest Academy, which trains people in organizing. So side note, I've been through their training. They're excellent. I highly recommend them. But your evaluation checklist will help you with the final step of issue framing, which is an important part of developing a messaging strategy. So here's an example issue evaluation checklist. A couple of things for your consideration. It results in a real improvement in people's lives. It gives people a sense of their own power and alters the relations of power. It's worthwhile. It's winnable. It'll be widely felt. It'll be deeply felt. It should be easy to understand. You should have a clear target in mind, like a decision maker, and have a clear time frame that works for you. Should be non-divisive. I know that one's difficult. Should build leadership. Maybe it sets up your organization for the next campaign. Should have a pocketbook angle, meaning how is this going to improve people's lives from that perspective, like financially or in terms of investments? It raises money or resources for the cause, and it's consistent with your values and vision. This is just an example, but for your organization, you can develop something different than this. Let's go to the next slide. Once you have chosen an issue, you can map the stakeholders that are involved. And I'm not going to spend time on this here because you all were introduced to faction mapping during our last session and you had some practice time with the tool. And that tool can be found in our shared Google Drive or Google folder for the course. Let's go to the next slide. All right, next step in this process of strategic communications planning. With your stakeholders identified, you can further categorize them by how much trust and agreement there is between you. So this kind of chart is really common in organizing. It guides you to think through allegiances so that you can figure out where to direct your energies in building project support. I don't love all the category names here, but there are allies, opponents, adversaries, fence sitters, and bedfellows. And on the next slide, we're going to walk through each one. So next slide. You'll see here the reference I was making to the intersection of trust and agreement on the chart. As we're going through these descriptions, keep in mind a project that you're working on or have in mind to work on, and some key stakeholders that fit into each of these categories. So allies support your efforts. Opponents don't agree with you, but are open to dialogue and help you identify where support is needed. Bedfellows are agreeable, but they may have hidden motives. They may not be able to commit, or maybe they lack follow through. Fence sitters don't seem to have an agenda. They don't really commit, and your relations, there's a lot of doubt there. And then adversaries don't agree with you, and your relations remain adversarial, even after negotiations and attempt to influence them have failed. So on the next slide, I'll share some specific communication strategies for each of these types of allegiances. So starting with allies. Because you can count on these individuals to support your work, they can potentially spread your message and help you to communicate with opponents with whom they might have relationships. So they are your loyal message bearers. As for opponents, it may seem counterintuitive that they're trustworthy since they don't agree with you, but because of this, they can help you refine your strategy by playing devil's advocate. So in a way, they become your co-strategists, whether or not they know it. Skipping down to number 5, adversaries. Oh, sorry, it's actually going to go to number 3. But Yeah, let's go there. That's my bad. So about bedfellows, given that actions with them seem to be limited to head nodding, you want to identify shared goals and your desire to have a better working relationship. You can also let them know what your plans are, including when you make changes. So let's go ahead and click and see which one it comes up with next. Okay, it actually did go in order. So let's go to fence sitters. So that relationship requires clarity. You tell them what you want from them, and if they still don't commit, you express your disappointment and ask them what it would take for them to get on board. And now going back to adversaries, which I was originally going to draw a contrast between opponents and adversaries. Adversaries are disagreeable and that relationship is not trustworthy. So the goal is not to change these stakeholders' minds. The best you can do is be transparent and forthcoming and express your concern about the relationship and invite them to do the same. And you can let these individuals know that you plan to pursue your agenda despite their opposition and hope that the relationship can change at some point. So just open door if things should change. And those are just a few strategic communication strategies based on what kinds of stakeholders you're working with. And from that strategy perspective, you really need to focus on building your power base of support with allies and refining your strategy through communications with opponents. So we'll star those. But in situations where you need certain stakeholders for certain things, say in policy advocacy or some other form of decision making, you might need to engage some of these other stakeholder types, and you can return to your faction map for some guidance. So let's go to the next slide. All right. A final part of strategic communications with your faction map and your allegiance chart, or so to speak, in hand, you might be ready to use this simple tool. So this is a message wheel, and it guides you through the process of creating messages tailored to your audiences. And it's good to note that messages that are consistent with the values of whoever it is you're speaking to, it does a better job of ensuring that acceptance and implementation will be easier based on whatever behavior or policy change you're proposing. And effective messaging also narrows focus and makes a few strong points that people remember rather than multiple points that they have to sift through and then decide amongst all of that what's important. So, for example, whenever I've been a part of coalition work, I was the one who was asked to talk to whoever didn't agree with what was happening. And that's because I'd previously been a media marketing consultant and constantly had to listen to or listen for what people were looking for and have a solution for whatever hesitations they had. And although I didn't specifically use this tool, I was applying the same concept as I prepared to talk with people. The message wheel develops the right message points for each specific target. And although we won't have time to work with this tool today, I'm still going to walk you through it and follow up with an example. And I think Susan already dropped a link to the tool in the chat box. So let's get started on this tool. You start here in the center box. Let's go back one on this slide. Thank you. You start here in the center box by identifying a specific issue, your target, and the particular value position the target holds. Your faction map would have helped with that too, because we did have a part on there about identifying loyalties. So we've already got that part down. And then the top section, that is your value message. That is your opportunity to make the connection with the person you're talking with. So for those who already agree with you, you can make this point quickly and move to the next topic. But for new targets that you might not have established a relationship with, this is an area where you want to spend a little bit more time and probably prepare some materials in advance. So then we move through the message wheel and go to the section on the right, which is the barrier message. And this is about countering misconceptions. So you need to think about the urban legends that have emerged around the issue that you're discussing. The key to a successful barrier message is that you do not repeat your audience's or your target's misconception. We're not trying to feed into that. The focus is on obtaining buy-in, and that's by presenting new or unexpected information to change the course of the conversation, not to get into a debate. So then we move to the bottom section, and that is about the ask. At least one of your message points should be focused toward this end, your ask. And you have to keep in mind the degree of change you're requesting of someone and whatever their comfort zone is, which we've also done some work around. Ask yourself, is this ask really attainable? Is it easily attainable? Can you help bridge the gap in some way if there are concerns? And what's in it for your target? And that we often refer to as the WIFM, what's in it for me? And that is addressed by the section all the way to the left representing the vision message. This is the, if you do what I ask, then you'll get what you want of the message. Okay, so we've gone through this whole tool, and I'm going to walk you through an example on the next slide. All right, so this one is focused on local foods procurement. And local foods procurement on government property is something I've worked on with food policy councils. So this is an example that was created quite some years ago that still has relevance, although we do acknowledge the political context that we're operating in right now. So here we have identified the issue, the target, and their value position, budget, meeting federal guidelines, student health. Let's go to the next slide. We're going to go up to the value message, and it is the initial offer or showing of your hand. In this case, we're letting the procurement officer know what our ultimate goal is, but we're making sure there's alignment with their values. So I'm going to attempt to read this. Here's the message, the value message. Working with local producers to supply fresh produce has double benefit. Better quality food contributes to improved health outcomes for students, and the contribution to the local economy builds community vitality, keeping current families in the school district and attracting new ones. Increases in local purchasing expands markets for local producers. Increased demand warrants an increase in supply, thus producing economies of scale and ultimately lowering costs for you. Now, just a quick aside, you're not literally going to go in there and read off a piece of paper word for word what you see here. This is a guide for your conversation so that you can get comfortable being in that situation. Let's go to the next slide with the barrier message. All right, so there's a lot here, but with this barrier message, the procurement officer is expressing concern with contracts and federal guidelines. These are their values. And you need to ease those concerns by making counterpoints and providing resources to overcome those barriers. So, procurement officer says, we have contracts in place that give us the best possible value. In other words, I'm not interested in negotiating with you on anything. You could say, increases in local purchasing expands markets for local producers. With increased demand, farmers can plan ahead and increase their supply. That predictability and scaling helps lower costs. And you come equipped with some examples. Here are some examples of successful partnerships where we've done this. Here's another concern. We have strict purchasing guidelines we need to follow. Of course, and the USDA is supportive of local food systems. In fact, they've developed a number of tools to help make local food purchasing easier, including ... So you come prepared to address what those concerns are probably going to be. Let's go to the next slide with the ask. All right. So this is what you've been trying to build up to in conversation. And depending on the situation, it may not be the end all be all ask like we were starting to outline in the value message. It might just be a first step towards that. For new relationships, it needs to be lower risk. And for established relationships, it might be anywhere along the spectrum. You can use your best judgment based on the relationship and the political climate. So the ask here is for the former. So we're going low risk. Here it says, would you be willing to take a first step toward exploring your menu planning options by working with the local food policy council to conduct a lunchroom food waste audit and follow up consumer preference survey? So we've got a strategy that we're presenting to try to work towards the ultimate goal. Cafeterias are notorious for producing food waste. It's good practice to check up on what students are and aren't eating as a potential cost saving measure. Our Food Policy Council can work with Extension to provide a fast, easy, convenient training for lunchroom staff and any students that would be interested in participating. So we're also closing some gaps that he or she may be concerned with in agreeing to do something like this. And let's go to the next slide with the vision message. So the vision message brings it all together. It connects the ask to the benefit. So we've just asked the procurement officer to make a commitment with this food waste audit. And now we're telling them how that low risk commitment is going to improve their performance with little effort required of them. And it's working us toward our ultimate goal. And it bridges back to the value message. So here we've got, once we've gathered some data, we can determine if local purchasing is right for the school district. Developing local purchasing relationships has the potential to provide you with flexible, responsive service. At minimum, this data will help you to make better purchasing decisions to improve your bottom line. And we're available to help facilitate these processes. So it's win, 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 because you've gone through and anticipated what some of the concerns might be and how you can bridge some gaps, and you have connected to their values. So that's it. A little bit of a teach on strategic communication strategies. And I highly encourage you to practice among your teams. Every morning when I was a media marketing consultant, we would model a current client campaign pitch at random. You just got called on at 8:15 in the morning. And you had to be ready for somebody to pretend to be one of your clients and respond. And I could tell you some anxiety inducing stories about that. But the point is that practice makes progress. Okay, let's go to the next slide. Before I go on here, let me just do a quick temperature check with all of you. All together, do you find these communications tools, thinking back to the last session and just this small teach on strategic communications, do you find it applicable to what you're working on and potentially effective for your work? How do you see yourself applying this? Let's just hear from a couple of you, just a few comments. You can come off mute or even use the chat box. This slide takes us back. Thank you, Andrew. This slide takes us back to our premise for the course, that we are establishing a project design framework to contribute to sustainable change by introducing processes to plan, manage, and organize projects that grow impact while maintaining quality and community connection. This is cultivating the project leadership ecosystem, and it will require us to let go of things that don't truly serve the vision in order to make room for those things that do, or at least to prioritize them in value and time accordingly. So loss is inevitable, and we don't make much space for its transformative potential. Loss has a negative connotation to it. And I had a quote that I was going to share with you all. Maybe I'll put it in the chat box, but I want to make sure that we're kind of keeping to our timeline here. So I'm going to switch off with Tina and let her pick up on how we speak to loss.
Yeah, thanks, Kalia. This was really good content in terms of our design and tools for tasks. But there's a really meaningful piece of leadership to this, and we wanted to put it right up at the top. And it's this idea of speaking to loss. It is a function of leadership. To everything you just experienced with Kalia, we're navigating strategic communications. We're being intentional in our design of our partners and what partnership looks like. We have messaging designed, and then whilst the work grows, we're often asked, what are you taking off your plate? And when are we letting go of things to be more efficient for the next thing? Because we're in systems change. As Kalia said beautifully, we're working in 30-year generational systems change in increments of the minute funded 2 to 3 year grant cycles. So loss is a space, and the ability to speak to this is an act of leadership. And the adaptive leadership phrase is speak to loss, but I like to rename it and say ask and listen to the loss. I can't presume to know what your loss is, nor what's been taken off of your plate that was very meaningful, but for the sake of the work, to engage the partnerships, it's got to be let go of. So we ask and we listen to the loss. And listening to the loss is going to take us to the edge of that comfort. Listening to loss is not a space that feels good for everyone, but it's a necessary component. It's a key ingredient to systems change work. The loss aversion theory in psychology tells us that loss has a disproportionately larger impact psychologically than a gain of equal size. And in the adaptive leadership space, Marty Linsky says in his book, Adaptive Leadership, that humans aren't resistant to change. It is not the change, it is the real or perceived loss that I will experience that's associated with that change. So leadership is about the ability to speak, the ability to ask and listen in the space of loss. And loss comes inherently from the magnitude of the work we're doing, the breadth of partnerships that we're engaging, the messaging that goes into this. It's a lot of work. And I love that Clea said, what are we letting go of? Right? Because mentors tell us, what are we letting go of to prevent burnout? It's not possible in systems change. We are all in the work of doing it all. Every one of us. I ask you, I bet if we took 5 minutes to journal what's on your task list to do right now, you would come up with at least 25 to 30 things right off the top of your head, right? The ability to exercise leadership as an activity is the ability to talk about loss. Why do we do this? Because it's creating necessary trust among us. The ability to do this well is a tie that might bind us more productively down the road. It might repair bridges as we validate feelings. It's an element of trustworthy processes, and the ability to do this might help others get unstuck. Often we hold on to the loss that's not been spoken to, and it prevents us from moving forward. Then the loss becomes a barrier. So when we consider that and partner it with Kalia's messaging wheel, how might we speak to the loss as a barrier so we can move forward? But it's hard. It feels risky. As humans, we're not designed to navigate uncertainty and conflict. And we have to often look in the mirror and say, because of this loss, what's my part of the mess? And we really like that edge that makes us uncomfortable to retract from it. And we want everything to work out. We like to envision a world where everything's working out and I don't have to go to that uncomfortable edge. So how are some tips and ways we might do this? In adaptive leadership, we actually say with this phrase, I know how you feel, we remove it. Because then in a lost space of another, I'm making it about myself. I can't presume to know what someone's experiencing. I can only ask a curious, powerful question and then listen. Inviting others to share across and share their loss. And in leadership, this is really difficult, but man, if we could get better of resisting the urge to respond to every comment when we're having a lost conversation. I was working with a group of 134 firefighters, and in a 24-hour period, they lost their fire chief and they lost 8 battalion chiefs, and they were sitting with immense loss that hadn't been spoken to. And I suspect from the nature of their work, they were very armored with some tension and triggers, and they were very angry. And we really just started off creating a space to speak to their loss. And with 134 firefighters, I said, folks, it's about shutting up and listening to the loss. And that's a harsh word. That's a pretty provocative word, but sometimes we just have to shut up and listen to the loss. And in order to do so, it requires us to be really authentic and vulnerable. And that's a me space. Doing less rather than doing more. And this might be a stretch of our comfort zone. So before we move into the next session, I want to take a minute to talk about this idea of loss and what's resonating with you, certainly in relation to all of that strategic communication, faction mapping, communicating with our partners in this idea of loss. We'd love to have a few voices into this whole group space. Feel it, we don't know where it's going. We understand our work is meaningful, but it's also very hard. So a huge piece of leadership is our ability to take care of ourselves. It is a required piece of this work. It is not an adage of, oh, that's something we used to say in the 90s and nobody really does it. No, it's absolutely imperative we take care of ourselves or we will not be there tomorrow to keep doing the work. So, couple of questions with respect to time. I want you to just kind of note these, dump some ideas in the chat. But if we have a couple of people, let's take some voices of this first one. What are the signals that you experience, like the caution flags coming up that you need to take care of yourself? What are those signals for you? I'm really curious. And yeah, feel free to and just dump these in the chat as well. These are going to be some questions of self-reflection, but who could join us on what are some signals you need to take care of yourself?
Right. Thanks, Tina. So you might recall that during our first session, Tina had a section on raising the heat. And she said, we need to make it more uncomfortable not to address an issue than to live with it. Because when we keep applying standard formulas to issues that require this systemic change level creativity, we're not pushing the boundaries to change the equation altogether. Keep approaching the problem the same way. We need experiments that will push those boundaries, and we need to be able to diagnose well to develop those experiments. And that includes recognizing the context we're working in, the extent to which we can push a boundary, and the partners we have around us to play strategic roles, including doing some of the things that we may not be allowed to do, or as we've been talking about, we just don't have the capacity to do it. So Susan is going to drop 2 links to websites in the chat box that take a participatory, equity-centered approach to solutions design. And it's just a little bit of inspiration for you guys to call to. Let's go to the next slide. All right. So this is a good transition into talking about strategic change. At the beginning of this course, we introduced the concept of change management, and we're going to spend some time going over strategic change steps, starting with identifying change initiatives and then assessing strategic importance and complexity, and then categorizing change. initiatives. And these strategies will hopefully help you to prioritize and plan your action steps in a way that changes the way you spend your time trying to create impact through your projects. Next slide. So here, step one, identifying change initiatives. Where exactly do you start? We ended the first session of our course on this slide with a force field analysis tool. And it's a good place to start. That tool is available in the Google folder. And as a reminder for conducting this analysis, you first identify all the potential change initiatives that could impact your organization's strategy, including changes across various areas like processes, technology, structure, and culture. And ultimately, this can be internally and externally focused. You can be doing this for your project, you can be doing this for your organization. But let's focus on your project, which is externally facing first. And then after we get to step two, you might be able to come back to this for an organizational assessment. And there's a reason for that. So what you want to do next is collect relevant data on each one of those proposed change initiatives. So that would include objectives, potential impact, the resources required, and what a timeline for implementing it might look like. And your organization might have some of this information on hand already, or you might have some of this information just, for your project specifically. But you also might need to go talk to some more stakeholders to get a full picture. And in our last session, we shared the engagement streams framework, and it has different dialogue formats that you can choose from for public engagement. So that might be of use here as well. So then lastly, for your force field analysis, you categorize those data points as either supporting or restricting change on a scale of 1 to 5, where 5 is most impactful in terms of achieving that change. So this helps you to evaluate the strategic importance of each change initiative and consider factors like the potential benefits and alignment with organizational priorities. So then this sets us up for the next step on the next slide. All right, so step two is assessing strategic importance and complexity. And this Lippitt-Noster model for managing complex change, so on and so forth, serves as a guide to assess organizational readiness for change before initiating any transformation efforts. So it's a complement to the force field analysis in that the change initiatives you identified for your project are going to fit into one or more of these categories: the organization vision, decision making, which consensus falls under, skills, incentives, resources, and strategic action plan. And through your categorization efforts, you will be considering whether the change initiatives you proposed are in alignment with your organization's goals and your organization's capacity for each one of these categories. So, although you could use this tool to look at things at a project level, this one is really getting at the organization, because whatever you're doing in your project, if your organization is not built to support that, you're going to have a problem at some point in the process. So it is useful at some point to take that whole organizational picture into account if you're trying to work toward sustainable change. This is going to be kind of reciprocal back and forth, looking at the project and looking at the organization. So let's go to the next slide. So the previous slide was just the top row of this model. This is the full model, and it explains why change fails. So this is what happens when a component is missing. We'll go through it real quick. Without a clear vision, confusion. emerges because vision provides direction and purpose, which helps staff to understand the importance and goals of change. Without consensus, efforts will be sabotaged because consensus ensures that everyone is on the same page and committed to the change, which reduces resistance and fosters cooperation. Without the skills needed to implement the change, then we create anxiety. Skills are essential for executing the change plan effectively and efficiently. So, in this case, training and development might be needed to mitigate that. If there's no incentive, you risk resistance. Incentives, whether they're intrinsic or extrinsic, motivate individuals to embrace and support change. So that might be recognition, rewards, or opportunities for personal growth. Without resources, frustration grows. Time, budget, and tools are vital for the practical implementation of change, and adequate allocation of these resources ensures that staff can carry out the action plan without unnecessary obstacles. And then finally, the absence of an action plan results in a series of false starts because your action plan provides a clear roadmap for the change process, outlining the steps, the timeline, and responsibilities. And without it, efforts can be disjointed and ineffective. So I'm guessing some of you may have had experience with this on projects or within your organization. And I want to take a quick poll of which of these conditions you have most often encountered in a rocky change initiative. So Andrew, let's get the poll up. And just a note, you're going to be able to pick more than one. So I'm going to give you guys about 2 minutes to answer this poll, and let's see your answers rolling in. And if it is necessary, definitely choose more than one, whatever your experience has been. Which of these conditions have you most often encountered in a rocky change initiative? Okay, so we're going to continue with assessing strategic importance and complexity. And this is going to look at feasibility. Just a note, I tend to pull multiple frameworks and tools together to develop a process, but you can exercise choice among any of the resources that we've provided and create your own blueprint. This is not prescriptive. You can experiment with the application of these tools according to your project needs. And that's the design approach we've been speaking to throughout this course. But this is the 4 dimensions of change model. And it helps you to assess the proposed changes by level, like individual versus organizational, and is either hard or soft. And although this is designed for organizational assessment, it can also be easily translated for community-based projects. So I just want to reiterate that what you do in the community is going to be helped or hindered by the capacity and health of your organization. So quickly starting in the upper left-hand quadrant and going clockwise, hard and individual changes include structural changes that affect individuals. Then hard and organization or community changes include structural changes that affect the collective. Soft and organizational or community changes include collective discussions and learning, and soft and individual changes include individual learning and support systems. So keep in mind that what you're ultimately working toward is a mix of solutions to create sustainable systemic change. And as you work to transform the community, your organization has to transform as well. Next slide. Step 3 is categorizing change initiatives with a strategic change matrix. Now, I know that this looks almost identical to the 4 dimensions of change model on the previous slide. I had to make some sort of visual for each of these slides, and this was honestly the most appropriate and fast graphic I could come up with. The difference, though, is that the previous model was about assessing feasibility of proposed change initiatives, and this one is a tool for prioritizing them. So this categorizes proposed changes by level of importance and complexity. Again, starting in the upper left-hand quadrant and then going clockwise. Low importance change initiatives with high complexity are cautious moves. And these changes are complex but aren't critical to your organization strategy. These should be approached with caution and only undertaken if resources allow. Then we have high importance change initiatives with high complexity, and these are transformational projects. These are strategic changes that are crucial for the organization, but challenging to implement, requiring significant resources, time, and management attention. So going down to the bottom, we have high importance change initiatives with low complexity, and these are quick wins. These are critical strategic changes that are relatively easy to implement, and these should be prioritized for immediate action to build momentum. And then finally, we have low importance change initiatives with low complexity. And these are low hanging fruits. They're changes that are easy to implement, but they might have minimal strategic impact. And these can be considered for minor improvements, but they're not a priority. And we are going to expound on this tool a little further in our next section. The nice thing about this tool is that you could categorize all of your project-based and organizational activities to see how energies are being directed. What your organization does internally works hand in hand with the external work. But let's just take a break instead. So everyone, let's see you back at 45 past the hour. We'll take a 10-minute break.
Yeah. We'll see you back in 10 minutes, folks. Halfway through. Thanks for your time this morning. Thank you, Andrew. I know a short 10 minutes to stretch it out, get recentered and our thoughts gathered as this last hour and a half together. I'm going to call us back to some leadership work we did in our last session, session 2, this idea of getting used to uncertainty and conflict in this work as we're navigating partnerships and building trustworthy processes in our projects for the longevity and sustainability of systems change. This idea of the comfort zone, we did some work on what stretches us in our comfort zone. And contained within this, our strengths, our vulnerabilities, our triggers, and that we are encountering all kinds of individuals in this world, and we're encountering all kinds of situations. And there's going to be a good amount of people and situations that we work really well with, that resonate with us, that are on our frequency and mode of work. And those are individuals and situations that are in our comfort zone. Okay. Exercising leadership is an activity, especially through the dynamic work of projects, systems change, nonprofit community work. We are trying things as we're diagnosing these situations and faction mapping and messaging and strategic communications. We're trying things that are going to be a little uncomfortable as we find ourselves in some uncertain times, unprecedented times with funding, with previous partnerships that are gone. So this idea of our comfort zone, we did some work with. And we acknowledge that we experience vulnerabilities and triggers as those things we're trying stretch our comfort. And we're taking on new behaviors of leadership. So we're going to have a couple of minutes of quiet reflective space, whatever your respective writing is, if it's digital, if it's pencil and paper, or if you would like to just contain those thoughts within yourself. I want us to reflect on something that is very personal. It will not be shared out. This is the gift to yourself for some self-awareness and taking that time to identify words, phrases, groups, individuals, certain situations or actions that you would experience that are triggering to you. This is a space of self-awareness in our comfort zone. In regards to working with others, the invite, please, is take the time to reflect on that. It will not be shared out. We just want that attention brought to the forefront of our mind. So I'll hold time and space for just 2 minutes to get your thoughts around this question. Got one more minute to collect your thoughts. Okay. Now that we have a sense of people or situations, factions, actions, the context of things that are triggering to us, um, we want to understand how we lead through this change management work when we're encountered with triggering things, things that are stretching our comfort zone. We're going to go into some breakout rooms and we're going to have some conversation around these 3 factors right here. Not any language or sharing of what is triggering to you, but what happens within yourself. What is transpiring within you when you're experiencing a little bit of stretch of your comfort that we call triggers? What do I notice within myself when I'm triggered? What's that introspective response that maybe others cannot be aware of? They don't see. It's not visual, but I know it's happening within me. What do others observe on me and of me when I'm triggered? When others are sitting in a space with Tina, they can observe very tangible things. What are those things for you? And then what's the result if I'm not managing this stuff? If I'm experiencing burnout, I'm having more partnerships, the plate's getting fuller, things aren't coming off, there's loss that hasn't been spoken to. So what's the result? I would love to just have a conversation around those 3. And as you round out your time, what were 2 to 3, possibly 1 or 2 tools you use to manage yourself in the moment? I would love that sharing. Let's just cultivate some ideas, because what works well for some may not work well for others. And what works well for some may be a new idea of something you'd like to try. So what are some ways you might manage yourself in the moment, and enjoy sharing those? Okay, Andrew's going to put us into some breakout rooms. We're going to be in some groups of 3 to 4. Susan is going to drop this all into the chat for you. And I will bring you back in 10 minutes. You'll have a 10-minute block of time to enjoy this conversation of what you notice in yourself, what others may notice, and then what's the result when this stuff goes unmanaged.
All right, thank you, Tina. So thus far, we've talked through establishing your project and diagnosing technical versus adaptive issues, going all the way back to our first session. We've anticipated project challenges. We've identified stakeholders and learned how to raise the heat. We've considered the role of identity and power dynamics in engaging underrepresented voices, in addition to navigating conflict. We've touched on communications planning and today presented you with communication strategies. We also started the work of reframing our concept of time management looking at loss, and embarking on strategic change initiatives. That's a lot in 2.5 sessions. But now we're going to pick up with the last few steps of the change process to transition us into evaluation and wrap this course up. And as we're getting started, I just want to quickly note that at the end of this section, there are some slides providing an overview and comparison of project management tools. But as we share at the top of each of these sessions, this course isn't focused on providing training on that. So we're not going to go through it, but you'll still have it for your reference. All right, these last couple of steps after the change analysis, we focus on developing action plans and implementation and monitoring. Next slide. Okay. So just before the break, we left off with this strategic change matrix, and this is going to launch you into action planning, being able to prioritize what actions you will take. So based on which quadrant the change initiatives you choose fall into, there are best practices for developing your action plans. For transformational projects of high importance and complexity, you need to develop detailed action plans that allocate significant resources and attention to management to ensure that the implementation will be successful. And your efforts also need to pay special attention to keeping others motivated and incorporate some quick wins along the way to transformation. With those high importance, low complexity, quick wins, you should prioritize those change initiatives immediately because quick wins build momentum and demonstrate progress. So this can be especially useful in situations and or communities where you need to build trust. Low importance, high complexity, cautious moves should be approached in just that way, cautiously. These change initiatives really should only be undertaken if resources allow and if they offer long-term benefits. So you might think of these as cherry on top of the sundae strategies, but if folks are really pushing for these kind of changes, you should be ready to engage in some curious but potentially tough conversations about it. And then finally, with low hanging fruit initiatives, which are low importance and complexity, low complexity, these changes, they're reserved for minor improvements and they can be addressed opportunistically without having to allocate significant resources to them. So they might be ideal for experimentation and getting people used to new processes. And in all of our previous sessions, we provided quite a bit of technical guidance on how to determine your project scope, including the development of goals and objectives and resource allocation. So we don't need to get back into that part of project planning. But as for project scope in relation to implementation, you should always begin with the end in mind. So next slide. Step 5, implementation and monitoring, is going to continue that theme of beginning with the end in mind. And we're going to spend a little bit of time in this space because evaluation is so often the place where the fewest resources get allocated or they're cut altogether. And it's also an area where a project team often needs help, but defining metrics for success is a matter of what is valued, and not all things we value are measurable in the traditional sense. Next slide. So with that, we might need to reconsider what our metrics for success are, and we can start with this premise. Us as the instrument of change, you as the instrument of change. And what does that mean, really? So over the next few slides, I'm going to present a framework that some of you may already be familiar with, but it can be useful in redefining your work and the metrics associated with it. Next slide. All right, equitable evaluation framework. It comes from philanthropy. which, as we know, deeply influences the nature of our food systems projects. And Susan will drop the link in the chat box to the equitable evaluation framework. But the framework is comprised of principles. There's 3 principles, and they serve as the foundational guideposts for evaluation. And then there's a set of orthodoxies, as they describe them, which is just they're tightly held beliefs. And they're meant to be questioned or challenged. And if we don't, they can undermine the 3 principles that we guide our evaluation by. And then there are this grouping of mindsets, tensions, and sticking points that can help you navigate those orthodoxies, those tightly held beliefs. Mindsets are an established set of mental attitudes that we are trying to shift towards. So there are things that we may possess, and we're trying to shift away from them and towards new mindsets. Tensions are inherent strains to be named, navigated, and normalized. It's a part of the work. And then sticking points are obstacles or barriers to be moved through, over, under, or around. This is where we get into some strategies. And over the next couple of slides, I'll talk about each of these components of the framework more in depth. Next slide. Okay. So these 2 pieces, the principles and orthodoxies, everything kind of gets built out on them. And the 3 principles say that first, evaluation and evaluative work should be in service of equity. And it posits that production, consumption, and management of evaluation and evaluative work should, at its core, hold a responsibility to advance progress towards equity. As for the second, evaluative work should be designed and implemented commiserate with the values underlying equity work, which is to say that it should be multiculturally valid. In other words, applicable across many different kinds of contexts and oriented toward participant ownership, not organizational ownership, participant ownership. And then third, evaluative work can and should answer critical questions about the ways in which historical and structural decisions have contributed to the issues we're addressing. It should address the effect of a strategy on different populations and on the underlying systemic drivers of inequity. And it should also examine the ways in which cultural context is tangled up in those structural conditions and the change initiative itself. So, in sum, with the principles, evaluation should be about equity and actually practice equity, which in turn means that it needs to investigate the systemic nature of the problems we're addressing and how they affect diverse cultures in both shared and unique ways. And this is all bringing identity and power dynamics back to the forefront in your evaluation. So, with the orthodoxies, which again are tightly held beliefs, there's a lot of assumptions made here that create our organizational cultures, and then they're reinforced by all of us within the organization. And they have an effect on evaluation for better or worse. And a lot of times it's usually related to equity. So it may be even that they reinforce inequities that are inherent to the dominant cultural values in society as a whole. And then it's just getting played out in our organization. And the framework does identify a lot of orthodoxies here. So I'm not going to go over each one. I'm going to keep it short just by sharing an example for 1 or 2 of them. So if we look at objectivity, rigor, and evidence, one of the orthodoxies, tightly held belief or assumption might be grantees and strategies are the focus of evaluation, but not the foundation. Or on the other hand, that stories are the best evidence of our impact, because numbers strip away the complexity and humanity of what we do. Another example with resources, since that was coming up in our managing complex change model. Evaluation requires money, expertise, and time that we just don't have. So my guess is that if you think through each one of these, you can probably come up with some examples of different assumptions that are made in these areas that show up in your work. And it's important to think about how that shapes our approaches in our projects. So let's go to the next slide. Okay. I mentioned earlier that mindsets, tensions, and sticking points, they can actually help you to navigate those deeply held beliefs and assumptions that are represented in those orthodoxies. And I'm going to share a few notes about each one of these. So, again, a mindset is an established set of mental attitudes that someone holds. And you can relate them to biases in that they play a significant role in how we interpret and respond to situations, both consciously and unconsciously. But if we just practice some thoughtful assessment or some diagnosing, we can shift mindset and change how we interpret and respond to those situations. So, managing self, this is how we tap into creativity and innovation and open new pathways towards systemic change. And this is an ongoing practice. So there should be movement, there should be potential explored, there should be expansion. And thinking back to what Tina has said about getting on the dance floor, this is like a dance, trying to move from an ingrained mindset toward a new one. And with any dance, there might be some missteps. So with tensions, they're a way to notice and bring up to the surface these interrelationships among things that affect one another. So they present some opportunities to name and address opposing ideas and approaches. And those are driven by different values and different fears that we hold. And these can be trigger points. But if, again, we look at them from an opportunistic standpoint, we can use this to shift the way we perceive competing values and work towards having a flow between those differences, managing those tensions and allowing for a both and for competing priorities and values to exist in space together. And the goal isn't to solve these tensions, but rather to recognize them, to name them, to normalize them and navigate them, because it's always going to be a part of our work, especially as it relates to identity, cultural values, etc. And then sticking points, they usually come up when there's some kind of pushback or a hiccup or something slows things down. And in turn, we might interpret that as a lack of commitment or resistance to change or a shift to other priorities. But again, from an opportunistic perspective, they can give us some space to reflect and experiment. Okay, so let's go to the next slide. And these slides, this is just going over some of what we've been talking about. We're going to switch through there. So those just have some additional information on the mindsets, the tensions, and the sticking points. But we've given you background information on all of that. And I want to give you all just something to take a mental note about. So this is something to take outside of this training and work through in your project teams to think about the mindsets, tensions, and sticking points that are associated with your project. And then ask yourselves, what would it take to shift mindsets, tensions, and sticking points? How does this look as a complete strategy? And what is within your control? Okay, let's go to the next slide. So this is where we start wrapping up and pulling all of the course competencies together. And I'm going to say it is really, really useful, and you should have a theory of change to help you draft your metric definitions. So as Tina and I were designing this course all the way up to this section on evaluation, I was thinking you really can't do project management leadership for sustainable change apart from having a theory of change. And we don't have enough time to go over it in this course. And there's that time trade-off thing again. But anyway, we went back and forth trying to find a solution. And in preparing for this presentation, I was at least able to get a few slides in here about it. And we can provide you with a tool from the Annie E. Casey Foundation, which Susan will drop a link to in the chat box. So I'm going to connect the equitable evaluation framework to our project leadership ecosystem and this idea of theory of change. So bear with me for a second. If you think about the principles for project management leadership, we displayed those by grounding ourselves in this course experience. We do that at the beginning of every session. The orthodoxies were outlined as our gathering the givens. Our mindsets were demonstrated through the adaptive leadership concepts that Tina presented. And then our tensions were represented through the care versus tolerance and case scenario activities, which identified the relationship between identity, bias, values, culture, power dynamics, and trust. Yes, we did all of that. Also, the influence of the nonprofit industrial complex on time management, prioritization, and loss. And then finally, sticking points have been identified in the traditional components of project management. So, by taking you all through this project leadership ecosystem framework, let's say that one more time. Project leadership ecosystem framework. Got it. We basically set you up to develop a meaningful theory of change to guide your work. And on this slide, it's just reiterating that theories of change, they help you to document your impact for measurement. You can use it as a communications and accountability tool. And my former project team and I started the process of co-developing a theory of change and transformation with our statewide network. And generally speaking, a theory of change consists of goals, strategies, and activities, which are then linked to outcomes and back to the goals. The theory of change is also built on a set of assumptions about change and considers external forces affecting change. We've talked about all of this throughout the course. So our project team worked with a consultant and our advisory team of network members to develop a draft theory of change and transformation that included sections focused on aspects of our network identity and vision, as well as current and desired future state. Goals were outlined in the vision. Our current state included assumptions and beliefs about what's needed to produce change in all of our associated activities. And the desired future state articulated change strategies and anticipated outcomes. And now the draft is being rolled out to the entire network through a year-long feedback and input strategy. And we were also working with another consultant to develop an entire evaluation framework around this. And it was based on a spectrum of food access to food justice to food sovereignty. And then we utilized the draft as the communications framework for grant-related reporting. That is what you can do with a theory of change. Pull it all together. So final slide for me on this section. This is just a list of questions that help to shift mindsets. It's all accessible through the link that Susan provided earlier to the equitable evaluation framework. But as a final note, I do want to call attention to shifting from extraction toward offering and from participatory to reciprocity. Oftentimes, we collect data from communities during projects, we go about our work, and we achieve our grant deliverables. And without intention, we can perpetuate harmful practices and reinforce the very system we're working to change. by not including the community in that process. So these two questions, how might you transform ways of engaging that extract intellectual property and ownership toward reciprocal processes? And how might you co-create accountability and allow for mutual benefit should underlie your communications planning to disseminate project progress and result as a part of your evaluation? So with that, Tina is going to talk more about asking powerful questions.
Thanks, Kalia. As I've been listening and taking in today's session, I've been thinking about this idea. The final tool I'm going to share with you, I think, is the most crucial piece that contains the through line to all of our work. And Susan had said something earlier. She said, yeah, I was thinking about where this lives in the project life cycle. And that instantly made me think we have the beginning, the middle, the end, where the engagement lies. And I purposefully, very intentionally, kept this idea of powerful questions at the very end as a way to see that this is the connectivity to jumping in with adaptive leadership through our project management. This is applicable everywhere, and there is an art to it. There's a craft, as you would say, to crafting and shaping more powerful questions. Going all the way back to the idea of technical versus adaptive and the components of the technical pieces of your job and work and projects, and the adaptive, powerful questions live here. The attitude we contain in our work, it must be rooted in curiosity. It must be rooted in being curious and holding a curious mindset. And the flow of adaptive leadership says that this work requires curiosity, and the root of curiosity is more discovery. Discovery is the impetus to powerful questions. Why? Because our aim is to mobilize others. We are not isolated in a vacuum. We are not working in silos, though we have situations that we feel siloed in communication, feel silo. Kalia's provided us with a lot of strategic communication tools, but our idea is to mobilize other forward. And there is to say, there's no bad questions, right? There's no bad questions, but there are always more powerful questions. Questions that yield more discovery. Questions when we're on the dance floor, engaged in the work, and we get reflective and diagnosis on the balcony of how to be more intentional, more purposeful. Powerful questions live there. So what makes a powerful question? What makes a powerful question? I like the very last one. Powerful questions evoke more questions. Powerful questions rarely are answered. They're thought-provoking. They're often coupled with silence. I know in coaching, when I ask a powerful question, my client says, huh. And I observe their brows come into a line, and I observe their mouth open a little bit because they're in a thought-provoking space. We hope to stimulate reflective conversation. And again, curiosity. Powerful questions live in curiosity. So how might we do that? 3 components to a powerful question. This is a great book. It's a little bit aged now. It was published in 2003, but The Art of Powerful Questions, Catalyzing Insight, Innovation, and Action. Grab it. There's 3 equal parts to a powerful question: the construction, the assumption, and the sequencing. We're going to go through a couple of these together, and then we're going to do a big activity. So get ready to come off mute. We're going to go through a fun activity that we're all very familiar with in the world of grant writing. So despite our best efforts, assumption and biases live in everything we speak, everything we say, in all conversations. So we must be aware of assumptions embedded in questions, and more importantly, when asking questions and engaging in conversation with partnerships across our faction work, how those questions with assumptions might influence others' responses. It is an assumption to ask leading question, folks, because it comes from a my space. I'm building a leading question. Have you tried this? Have you thought about this? From my space of trying, from my awareness and understanding and my lens. That's an assumption that I would hold. Avoid advice-giving questions. We call them at KLC, the Kansas Leadership Center, we call them questions. Have you ever heard a question? It's a suggestion guised at a question. Well, did you try? Have you thought about questions? So the ability to analyze questions and the ability to get better ourselves at designing powerful questions is going to be involved with looking at the assumptions. That project life cycle Susan spoke about earlier, she, said I'm grappling with where this tool lies in the project life cycle. I immediately thought of powerful questions and sequencing them in project design and project work. Powerful questions live at the beginning, the middle, and the end, and they're intentional and purposeful. In asking powerful questions in the beginning, it's how we might get really clear on the purpose and the work. And in the middle, it's on the dance floor. What are we missing? What's possible? What connections are emerging? What factions are we aware of that we weren't previously aware of? And in the very end of project work, what's next? What do we still need to do? So sequencing. Construction lies in those beautiful questions since we learned in third, fourth, fifth grade: who, what, where, why, when, and how. Seems simple, but when layered over sequencing, the idea of where the questions lie in our work, and assumptions, the construction becomes a little bit different. So that's where we're going to get ready to engage. We are all very well aware of the power of grant writing and the funding mechanism of what makes our work go around. So I've got a little hypothetical that all of us on this call are going to embark on. We're going to go for the big grant. We're going to go for a $25 million grant. And I know our last session, Susan was getting ready to go into a big funders meeting, and we are having this conversation around funders and how it is the keystone to our work. But what's behind grant writing is all of you very familiar. It is not just an individual seeking an RFP, it's a team effort. It's comprised of budgeting, accounting, the evaluation, the metrics, the writer, the author that's submitting, who's on the front lines doing community work, who's out gathering focus group and transcribing them so we can make a really banging RFP, and the administrative deployment. It's a team effort of many people, and it's not easy and it's not overnight. So if you would imagine those of us on this Zoom, what experience we have in some of these respective spaces. And if I were to tell you we took about 7 months to come up with this $25 million winning RFP, we are determined, we are driven, and we are very hopeful that our hard work will have paid off. And it's going to be meaningful, and it's going to have lasting impact in communities that we care about. So as you set into this feeling of seeking our $25 million RFP, you get an email at 4:37 on Friday that we did not get the grant. And I want you to check in with those triggers and those vulnerabilities and what you brought to the workspace and your teams and those that you've engaged in this work out in community, how your mind, body, and emotions feel at something as simple as an email that we did not get the grant. And here is the impact of powerful questions. You come in Monday morning to a 9 a.m. all teams meeting, and this is the first question I ask you. Which department was responsible for the proposal? I would love to get some voices off, and let's diagnose this question. What does this question set us up to do at 9 a.m. on Monday morning? Embark at the beginning of your project. Thanks, Andrew. The middle and the end of your project. So a couple of takeaways on powerful questions. How might you use these tomorrow, next week, in the work in some of the partnerships and factions that you're engaging? Top of mind, what's coming to you about this art of powerful questions? And it's going to be a stretch of your comfort zone, folks, from personal experience, as we all know, and engaging those factions and working with better messaging with stakeholder groups. The ability to say a better question might be, and then be very authentic and speak from the heart of when you hear assumptions, when you hear limited view, limited scope discovery questions. Might be an act of leadership to say a better question might be. And then really think about the breadth of the question in the construction and where these live in our projects. Are we asking some design questions really purposeful for the beginning? And we're now finding ourselves asking them at the end. How might we navigate that more efficiently next time? So with that, thanks for some powerful questions. I'm going to close this out with my dear colleague, Kalia.
So I mentioned this before, or as we were starting this section, that here at the end, there are project management tools and comparisons. So Tina, I'll just ask you to kind of click through the slides real quick so people can know, yes, they are here. We have many that we're going through to help you make some decisions and pull implementation and tracking together. And as always, at the end of our session, we do a recap of the processes, the tools, the exercises, the resources that we've shared. And that brings us to reflection. Reflection for today's session, for the overall course. Let's just start with today's session. What was really resonating with you and is still sitting in your soul?